The first video that I made on this channel was pretty much a video talking about vintage motorcycles and reasons why you should at least consider getting one. Anyways, I talked about many of the more obvious reasons to consider an old bike, things like the fact that they sound awesome, they're lightweight. So if you haven't seen that video, I definitely recommend it. I'll have it pop up as a card right now. Check it out, especially if you're just getting into vintage bikes. Also, there are some things to look out for. So I do have a video on reasons why you should maybe avoid getting a vintage motorcycle. But in this video, we're going to be looking at some more reasons why old motorcycles are awesome. And hopefully we can go a bit deeper. So buckle up, put on your flip-flops and your open face helmet. Let's dive in. The first thing to note is that vintage motorcycles, due to the fact that they are old, are unique. Each vintage motorcycle is a one-of-a-kind machine, in part because many manufacturers did build these bikes by hand, so they were all kind of unique, even right out of the box sometimes, but more because a machine that's been around for 40 or 50 or 60 or even 70 years, well, it's going to be a machine that has a story. Kind of like your grandparents, or for some of you, maybe you are a grandparent. You know, maybe you've been around for a long time and it's kind of made you unique and one of a kind. Whether it's things like the paint fading in a specific way because of how the bike was stored or how the bike was rode, dings, dents, scratches, scars if you like. Also little customizations made along the way to make the bike fit whoever its rider was. Vintage motorcycles, in my opinion, should be, as much as possible, left alone. I know fully restored old motorcycles are cool. I'm not against that per se, but I do think it's a bit like taking your grandpa in for a makeover and trying to have them remove all of his wrinkles. That is the stuff that makes an old bike what it is. A good example is my old Triumph. When I got it, it was just pristine, right? And it still is pristine to some extent. But I messed something up. The cork inside of the gas cap was old, and I filled the tank up with gas, took it for a ride, and came back and realized that because that cork was old, so basically some gas, but not really the gas, it was more the like sort of, I don't know, adhesive almost that's up there with the cork. Some of that ran out and got underneath the clear coat along with the gas, so now my bike has this little streak down the tank, and I was not happy when it happened, and I do still kind of hate that it's there, but I can't fix it. Like, I can't just clean it. I've cleaned it with everything. But am I really going to go strip all the paint off and like bring it back to the correct color? Because it's not quite the correct color for this bike for this year anyways. No, I'm just going to leave it. You know, it tells a story, and it's a reminder to replace that cork seal thing like every 6 months. Anyways, it's that kind of thing that makes each motorcycle unique. It's lived a life, basically. All right, number 9 goes to what I'm just going to call craftsmanship. You will hear people bemoan the lack of craftsmanship in products these days, which doesn't always mean that there's not some level of craftsmanship. But yeah, everything is designed and produced with computers and robots, and this applies to most motorcycles that you see today as well, especially the kinds of motorcycles that you can buy for, say, $6,000 or less. Now, of course, that doesn't mean those motorcycles aren't great motorcycles or beautiful or interesting or fun. There's nothing wrong with getting a new motorcycle, but understand that motorcycles are just not designed and produced the same way that motorcycles of, say, the 70s and 60s were. One has only to look at the exhaust and gas tank on my old Triumph and compare it to your average plastic bodywork for most new motorcycles. Owning something that is handcrafted is special, especially a machine like a motorcycle, because it goes beyond just what you see. It actually affects what you feel when you use the machine. The way that it rides, the way that it sounds, all of that comes from a place of passion for motorcycling from legendary companies. That's what you're getting when you're getting a vintage bike. You'll be hard-pressed to find a lazy motorcycle from the 60s or 70s or before. These were bikes that were designed and built in the countries the company comes from, and I don't know, I think that's a pretty cool thing. All right, number 8, vintage motorcycles are a great way to experience the past. This is really interesting, and it's why people love old automobiles and old machines in general. There's something cool for sure about, say, like an old coin or an old painting or an old piece of furniture, but when you're talking about vehicles, you get to experience that piece of history in a more visceral way. You know, getting to drive an old car or ride an old motorcycle puts you square in the shoes of the men and women from the past who also rode these vehicles. Often when I ride my old Triumph, I wonder what a new rider from, say, the 60s would have felt or thought when they jumped on this bike, you know? What did they think when they cracked open the throttle and heard that wonderful roar? What kind of political or social stuff was filling their mind as they escaped for a bit to go for a ride? Old motorcycles are a way to experience history, and I think that's a pretty cool thing. And I also think it's awesome to think that some dude in the 60s and in the 70s bought this motorcycle that I own and rode it and did exactly what I'm doing. Maybe they were a lot like me. I don't know. It's pretty cool. All right, number 7, old motorcycles are classy. Classic bikes are like a fine vintage watch or a fine wine. They give an aura of style and class. The person who buys a classic motorcycle is also someone who usually owns something like a yacht or who eats fancy burgers. They probably have a nice fitted suit in the closet. Now, it's really important to know that classy can easily turn into douchebaggery if you're not careful. So don't be a turd about your vintage motorcycle. Don't make people feel like their bike is less than yours. If you're on some cool old vintage bike and you meet some dude on like a Ninja 400, talk about their bike. Ask them about their bike. Don't just make them ask you questions about your bike. All motorcycles are cool. All of them are cool. Vintage motorcycles are cool, but in a different way than new bikes. It's not that they're more cool. They're just personally my kind of cool. All right, number 6, vintage motorcycles force you to become a better rider. Because vintage motorcycles have none of the modern rider aids, things like traction control and ABS, cornering ABS, wheelie control. Well, wheelie control doesn't really matter unless you're riding a Kawasaki Mach 3 from the 70s. Now, this is obviously a downside. You are not as safe on a vintage motorcycle, and people will complain about ABS and be like, oh, I don't need that. I'm good enough at riding. No, that's stupid. ABS can literally save anyone's life. It doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter if you're a MotoGP rider. Like, that's nonsense. But because those things aren't present, you do learn to take it easy on the bike, to really be aware of your surroundings, to really understand the risks going into a corner. You're more aware of weather conditions. Basically, you're not falling back on the technology to save you, and it does force you to become more aware. And on some level, that's good because it does make you a more aware and more in tune rider. All right, number 5 is similar to the last one. Riding a vintage motorcycle forces you to pay attention, primarily because they have significantly worse brakes. There's other things, but it's mainly the brakes. Now, again, that's obviously a reason that potentially you would not want to get a vintage bike. This is true of all vintage automobiles. If you're going to operate a 50 or 60 or 70-year-old automobile, you're getting that old brake technology as well. You have to give yourself more space between you and the car in front of you. You need to be even more aware when you ride into an intersection, because if someone does pull out, your bike is just going to slow down. It's not going to stop like on a dime, the way that new motorcycles do. Even new motorcycles with bad brakes, even 10, 15-year-old motorcycles with bad disc brakes that are not that like high end, like not Brembos or anything like that, they're still going to stop so much faster than these old bikes with drum brakes. So this is bad, obviously, in the sense that it makes you not as safe, but it's good in that it forces you to really pay attention. All right, number 4, vintage motorcycles are more raw. And this is true no matter how far you go back. Motorcycles have become more and more and more bogged down, not only because of emission regulations, but also all of the tech that we've talked about above. I'll save one of the most important aspects of this for later, but of course, a less restrictive muffler, for example, means that you have a more raw engine sound, but it's so much more than that. One of the primary advancements in motorcycle technology over the past 50 or so years has to do with frames, from the addition of things like subframes to the various materials used, the different types of frames. Now, all of that is amazing for performance, but these advancements have made motorcycles so much more smoother. Again, not a bad thing, but when you jump on an old motorcycle after riding modern bikes, you feel it. Like, literally, you can feel the difference in your hands, in your legs, in your butt. You feel what's happening underneath you. And sometimes that's great. Like, I love the vibration of the engine, but your hands can get a bit numb, especially when you rev the bike out or when you're at higher speeds. Again, this is true of pretty much all old bikes. There are some great classic motorcycles that handled this stuff well. Things like rubber mounted frames. We've got motorcycles like the Norton Commando and that featherbed frame that was just so incredibly smooth. So there are motorcycles that feel very modern that are like 40 and 50 years old, but a bike like my Triumph, it feels old and it feels raw. All in all, there's no denying that the older a motorcycle is, generally the more raw it feels. All right, number 3, and this is probably one of my favorite aspects of owning and riding an old motorcycle, is that they force you to know them. Because the technology is old and the bike has just been around a long time and has a nice long life, it's going to have all sorts of odd idiosyncrasies. Like my bike, for example, these old Triumph 500s have really sloppy gearboxes, and to the uninitiated, it can be rough. But I figured out how to basically never miss a gear. I pretty much never hit false neutrals, and the ability to do this has come over time, like pretty much a year's worth of riding. So when I first started riding this old bike, I would miss gears all the time, but I figured out the perfect RPM to shift at in spite of it not having a tachometer. Again, it's just feel and it's just understanding the bike. I figured out that when you shift, after you pull in the clutch, it's not like a new bike where you can just hammer through the gears and quick just pull in the clutch as fast as you want. There's a specific timing to when you should shift, and then also after you've pulled in the clutch, you want to let the RPMs drop just a little bit, quite a bit actually, and then you shift. And there's this timing to it that once you get right, you really don't miss gears anymore. There's sort of this zone where you throw it into gear and you don't hit false neutrals. This is just one example of how you really have to be in tune with the machine. To some people, this is annoying, and that's totally fine. If that sounds annoying to you, then maybe don't get an old Triumph, maybe get an old Honda, or get a new bike. Kickstarting is the same kind of thing. You really have to know how the bike is feeling. You really have to start it a bunch of times to get a sense for how it starts best. In my case, I forget this sometimes, but my bike needs no gas, like no throttle when I start it. It just starts great when I just kick it without any throttle. So owning a bike like this is just, it's more personal, it's more involved, and personally, I love that. And there's all sorts of fun things too. I think I talked about this in my other video, but it's also really fun when you get a vintage bike to have to learn more about the bike. And this kind of fits with what I was talking about, but like, it's fun to get a book, say, on the history of that brand, and also maybe get a specific book. Let's say you're going to get like a Triumph Bonneville, to get a book on the old Bonnevilles or the Bonnevilles through history to understand all the different models and understand what makes your bike unique within the model history. A lot of cool stuff. Again, another example of just getting to know your bike. All right, number 2, and for this one, I'm going to play a short video that I made a while back, but it has to do with the size of old motorcycles. Every time I get this bike out, I love it more. Like, it's just, I don't know what it is. One of my favorite angles, actually, is right here. I just feel like it looks so slim, you know? Modern manufacturers are forced to have these huge gas tanks just because of the, mileage. You would run out of gas so much quicker if you did a tank this size, but I don't really care about that. Give me something that looks cool. And to me, this small gas tank makes the bike look so much more proportional. And then the fact that you can see through it, that's what, one of the big things that makes modern classics not really look quite like these old bikes. Look how simple the engine is. You can't really do that anymore because you've got a radiator and you've got electronics and you just got all this junk in there and you can't see through it. But yeah. Essentially, new motorcycles have to be more bulky. Bulky is necessary when you have all of these electronics and, radiators, and engines, for example, have to be made larger for a lot of these bikes to keep the power just due to emission regulations. They're just having to make bikes bigger. A modern classic needs about 30% more cc's, for example, to make the same power as an actual classic motorcycle. Now, they're also being tuned for more torque, and modern classic motorcycles are, especially the Bonnevilles, they're basically cruisers. They're tuned like cruisers. They're big and heavy, but they have a ton of low-end torque. Much like cars, motorcycles have kept getting bigger, and I just love the look and feel of a light old classic bike. My bike feels like a dirt bike after you step off most modern motorcycles of the same power, like a 40-ish horsepower motorcycle. Old bikes are smaller and lighter, and people were smaller and lighter 50 years ago, so it kind of makes sense. If you're a bigger person, you want a bigger bike, probably. Like, it's gonna feel really, really small on a bike like mine. My bike is not a big bike at all. So that is something to consider, like how tall you are, although I am 6 foot, and I don't feel like my bike is small at all. And at the same time, it's an old bike, who cares if it's a little too small? But yeah, that is something to think about. So this might not actually be a pro for some of you, especially if you're used to larger bikes. But yeah, my bike pretty much feels like a dirt bike. Okay, this may be a bit silly, especially having this at number 1, but there's something about the carburetor / cable actuated throttle, especially the cable of an old motorcycle, that you just can't really replicate from a modern fuel injected ride-by-wire system. Now, I have not ridden every single ride-by-wire motorcycle that there is, and I've heard that there are new motorcycles with ride-by-wire that really do feel great, that really do try to give you the responsiveness and feel of a cable-actuated throttle. But you can't do it entirely. Like when you twist the throttle on an old bike, you are literally pulling open a mechanical slide in the carb so that the air and fuel can pass through into the cylinder. You can feel that. Like you can feel the tension on the throttle, and there's sort of like a weight to it. It's hard to explain, but ride-by-wire throttles try to imitate this, and they don't do it that well. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It's better than it used to be. Some ride-by-wire throttles are totally unintuitive and feel horrible. I understand this isn't possible on most motorcycles with all of the rider modes and ABS. You can't really have a cable-actuated throttle and have traction control and ABS and all that stuff. All of that is all connected. It's all controlled together. But again, if you're looking for that raw experience, it all starts at the throttle, you know? And vintage motorcycles just give you that level of feel that can really make a motorcycle, an old motorcycle, feel exciting. You know, they don't have to be fast. This is something people talk about a lot. Riding a slow bike fast is more fun than riding a fast bike slow. Well, let me say this. That applies on another level to old vintage bikes because they're so raw and there's so much feel. You don't have to be going 100 miles an hour on my bike to feel like you're absolutely flying, because you feel every bump in the road. You feel the throttle like just in a different way, and they are slow, technically speaking, but they feel fast. And I just think that's awesome. I just love that you feel more in tune with the power plant underneath you, and the throttle is the direct connection to that power plant. And so having more feel there, I don't know, I like it. Okay, enough of my ramblings. I would love to hear from you guys. Maybe those of you who've ridden and owned both new and old motorcycles, what do you think about having owned both? Which do you like better and why? Let us know down below. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Ride safe.